ladies and gentlemen, has spoiled itself on Europe. Good evening, everyone, or hello. You are once again welcome here on the podium of the Vigils of Conscience on the front page of international news. The former Ukrainian president, the one we call Lulukovich, he finally broke his silence after several years. He spoke up. What Europe is doing to Ukraine and how he has worked to help Ukraine move closer to the European Union. But during the intention in which he is seeing the European Union lead Ukraine, yes, he spoke very loudly. Beyond that, the European Union is on its knees. Criticism is coming from everywhere of the promise that the European Union had made. It's up to Donald Trump to be able to pay a lot of money to pay for fuel on America's side, American fuel, so that we can dispense them. Tariffs are bringing Europe to its knees, and even the amounts that were declared in the promise, in the famous negotiation promise, the European Union cannot keep. The European Union is weakened. Ladies and gentlemen, in the context of this video conference, we are going to talk about this revelation that was made by the former Ukrainian president and the lethargic situation in which the European Union finds itself in the face of the false promises, let's say, that were kept to President Donald Trump. But before we go into the depths, ladies and gentlemen, the current slogan is an African. With its application, each African with its application Moyen Express, go and download Moyen Express. Download Moyen Express is to support Africa of sovereignties. It is this application, it is this platform, I was going to say, of online sales that is called to replace Amazon on the continent. That is what this is all about. Let's go to the deep end, ladies and gentlemen. Yanukovych, the former Ukrainian president, he says clearly that Ukraine is being sacrificed by European arrogance. Ukraine is sacrificed by European arrogance. In Russia, Yanukovych recalls that he worked for an economic and political rapprochement with the European Union, therefore with Brussels. He worked for that, but it was so that his country could know the path of development. And not that his country is ruined as it is today. He continues, denouncing the arrogance and incomprehension of the Europeans during the negotiations. Why do Europeans not want to negotiate? Why they cling bitterly to the continuation of the conflict on the land of his ancestors? So, according to him, the refusal to negotiate. That's what led to the conflict. This contempt would have contributed to the previous instability and the explosion of the crisis in 2014. So, the former president, he joins the Russian narrative, a narrative that says the root causes of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict predate the time. As of 2014, this is because the Europeans have been hard-headed. That we ended up in this situation. It is the former president who speaks, which he agrees with Vladimir Putin. Imagine, of course, when Europe reaches out, it is not to dialogue, but to impose the result. Ukraine has been fractured and humiliated. Here is the conclusion, in a way, of what he said then. He is categorically opposed to Ukraine's accession to NATO. Yes, Ukraine's accession to NATO is seen by this former president as a path to chaos. A path to chaos. The former president calls Ukraine's accession to NATO a disaster and a direct path to civil war. He doesn't agree. He knows the existential realities of Ukraine. He knows what NATO is. NATO's ways of thinking, so it sounds the alarm. For him, Ukraine should not become a Western military base at Russia's doorstep. This gentleman spoke, Ukraine must not become a NATO military base on Russia's doorstep. So his same warning, his warning resonates today with the NATO obsession. Plunged the country into an endless war. So this gentleman, Lunukovich, had warned. He said so much equals civil war. 10 years later, those words sound like a fulfilled prophecy. Even though Ukraine is not yet in NATO, this is what this gentleman had to say. But when we start with the second element, the second part of our video conference, the European Union, still the European Union, Europe that has knelt before America. Making this promise to America is seen as an energy capitulation to the United States of America, $1.75 billion for American fuel. Here is the promise that von der Leyen had to make to Donald Trump. And so it's more like $750 billion. Yes, so the European Commission, which announced the massive purchase of American fuel for $750 billion. I said $1,000, it's more like billions of dollars. So we obviously have officials who criticize. And this gentleman called Zeitung sees it as a political capitulation and an admission of strategic bankruptcy. If Europe has accepted this, it is an admission of strategic bankruptcy. So he says that the European Union is turning away from its own interest to place itself in total dependence on Washington. So this is von der Leyen's arrogant Europe. With her neighbors, subject to her American master. This is the paradox that Mr. Zeitung, a European official, shows when he says that this is an admission of strategic weakness, obviously, because Europe is incapable of ensuring its energy autonomy. Europe is taking on debt to fuel its economy. And this dependence, which strengthens the weight of the United States in the war in Ukraine and in European domestic politics. Because America is putting its hand full in European politics at the moment. Meanwhile, Moscow is advancing militarily and politically, imposing its strength and resilience. Here is unfortunately such a situation in front of which. And Ukraine and the European Union meet. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this was the front page of international news. Thank you for sharing it as much as possible. I will return to you shortly by the grace of the Almighty with new news. It was the voice of your humble servant, the Samouraï.